Okay, I think we are live. So hello everyone and welcome to the Stand Student Festival 2020. We're in week 2 now of the festival. So for those of you who maybe have come to some of the events last week, welcome back. And for anybody that is new to the festival and this is your first event, we're really delighted to have you here. My name is Joanne and I work with Stand. We're a not-for-profit that works to engage university students on global justice issues. And this year the festival theme is climate enforced migration. So really what we're trying to do is raise awareness among students of the interconnectedness of climate change and migration and how climate change is, I suppose, creating a new wave of forced migration around the world. This particular event is focusing on women and climate change and migration. So we're going to be discussing a variety of topics around, I suppose, the unequal impact or the unequal threat that climate and forced migration poses to women in different communities around the world. And we have a great lineup of speakers here this evening. So I will actually hand over fairly quickly because I'm really excited for this and I know that there's lots to discuss. So we have our great moderator, Ailbhe Smyth, here with us this evening, and she's going to be taking us through the discussion. So Ailbhe, I might hand over to you if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here with Stand, which is a fantastic festival. So thank you very much for inviting me. But I am particularly thrilled and delighted to be here with this, really incredible international panel of very distinguished activists and scholars who have come together and agreed to come together to talk about the unequal impact of on women of climate migration. And before I introduce the speakers, I'm not going to speak at length because they really have such a wealth of experience and expertise and will lead us through, I hope, I'm sure, a very, very interesting conversation. But just to say that, sometimes still it puzzles me, but sometimes still people say, oh, well, why do we have to talk about gender? Well, we have to talk about gender because gender is absolutely central to absolutely everything that happens in our world, along with other factors. But gender is absolutely central as a determinant for your position, your situation, your possibilities, your life aspirations, and of course, your immediate everyday experiences. So there is no way that we can actually talk about climate migration without actually looking at gender. And when we speak about gender, so often we actually really physically and materially mean women. It's often struck me that women have gender and men have something else. I don't know. They are kind of the center. So our focus this evening is very specifically on women. And, I'm just very conscious myself of all of the very obvious ways in which climate-induced migration is going to have very particular impacts for women, because women are going to be there in so much more vulnerable situations, both in their country, their place of origin, as well as in any region or country that may be their not necessarily eventual, but that may be their destination. And just the final point, I am not a climate scholar. I think many of you will know I'm a feminist activist and LGBT campaigner and so on and so forth. I don't work in this particular area at all. So I was really very, very struck by the fact that I think we all know there are about 64 million forced migrants in the world for all kinds of reasons, including climate change, but that the UN forecasts that by the year 2050, there could be anywhere between 25, there could be up to 1 billion people who have had to migrate because of environmental causes. I mean, that's absolutely extraordinary. I gather that 200 million is seen as a more likely number, but whatever, it is just such a huge number of people, so we have to talk about it. I'm straight away going to briefly introduce our wonderful speakers. and tell you just a little bit about them, but then I will ask them to tell us themselves a bit more about their work. And maybe as I introduce you, you might actually just raise your hand and wave or something, whatever it is, at the listeners, the audience. First on my list here is Constance Okollet, and Constance is a farmer based in Uganda, and she's chairperson of the Osukuru United Women Network, otherwise known as OWN, which I think is fantastic, OWN, which is based in the Kayoro Osukuru sub-county. The network started in 2007, and its membership is now at just over 2,000 women, men, young people, older people, people with disabilities, all kinds of people. And of course, that platform gives all of those people a voice on a very important issue. She's also involved, Constance, in advocacy and lobbying with government, with policymakers, with NGOs for community programs in relation to rural communities, but also on broader environmental issues. Thank you so much, Constance, for being here with us this evening. Next on my list is Tanaya Dutta Gupta. Tanaya, who's waving there. Tanaya has an MA in geography from the University of Delhi and is currently doing a PhD in sociology at the University of California at Davis. Her research focuses on climate change, emigration, and borders in the Global South. She is an affiliate of the Global Migration Centre at UC Davis and is also visiting researcher at the International Centre for Climate Change and Development. Thank you very much, Tanaya, for being with us this evening. And my next panelist is Pelenise Alofa. Pelenise, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I got it okay? Pelenise is the national coordinator of the Kiribati Climate Action Network, which is an umbrella NGO in Kiribati, which is in the South Pacific. She is an active advocate for stopping climate change internationally and in the Pacific region. She successfully established the Banaban network in Fiji for the Banabana, an indigenous people who were resettled in Fiji. And she's working to create the Pacific node for the Climate Action Network, which I think many of you will know as CAN. She's also a teacher by profession and works closely with the Ministry for Education in Kiribati on educational policy issues. And last but by no means at all least is the very distinguished scholar Inderpal Grewal, who is with us this evening from her base in Yale University, where she is Professor Emerita in the program in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. I can't tell you how many books Inderpal has written. She has a really extensive list of fascinating books, many of which I remember from my own time in women's studies. But just to give you just a flavor, Home and Harem, Nation, Gender, Empire and the Cultures of Travel was published, I think, in the 1990s, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, okay, good. Transnational America, Feminism's Diaspora, Neoliberalisms is another one. And most recently, Saving the Security State, Exceptional Citizens in 21st Century America. And that is a really interesting title. She's currently working on projects addressing security regimes in the Global South, the resurgence of patriarchal authoritarian government, and on masculinity and bureaucracy. You're very welcome, Inderpal, as indeed are you all. And I'm just thinking that there is some benefit to Zoom. We've been able to assemble you from the four corners of the earth, which probably we couldn't have afforded to do in other circumstances. I want to ask each of you actually just to tell us a little bit about the work that you're actually doing at the moment. What is really grabbing your attention in terms of our perspective this evening of the unequal impact of gender on women, of climate migration? So maybe I'd start off with Tanaya.
Hi, everyone. I want to start by thanking Stand for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Um, I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of California, Davis, and my research focuses on climate change, mobility, and borders in the global south, with specific focus on the Bengal Delta region of Bangladesh and India. I ask how migrants confronting a changing climate perceive and experience borders, and how these experiences are gendered. My research involves in-depth interviews with internal migrants in Bangladesh and India who move from rural areas to become part of informal urban economy, as well as organizations working with climate change affected communities. I spent most of this year in Bangladesh and India conducting my fieldwork for dissertation. My fieldwork in Bangladesh had to be abruptly truncated because of the closure of the India-Bangladesh border due to the pandemic. I arrived in India just before the nationwide lockdown began since March 24th this year, which disproportionately affected internal migrant workers who because of the lockdown, were left stranded in urban centers without adequate food, shelter, and income support. And so, following my fieldwork in Bangladesh, that mainly involved in-depth interviews with migrants living in Dhaka's slums, rural community in the southwest coastal region of Bangladesh, as well as the organizations working uh, with the climate change affected communities there. In India, I had to reorient some elements of my research to conduct remote interviews over phone with migrants returning to their villages in the Bengal Delta region of the Indian Sundarbans, the coastal region in the state of West Bengal during the lockdown under challenging conditions, and who were further confronted by the disastrous effects of Cyclone Amphan that made landfall in the coastal regions of Bangladesh and eastern India on May 20th this year. And my goal has been mainly to document the cascading impacts of these multiple crises on mobility and livelihoods of the migrant community, and how their experiences can involve can inform existing knowledge and policy frameworks.
Thank you very much, Tanaya. I mean, just when you were talking, I was thinking this is incredibly complex, and of course, you actually, this was your precisely your final point, that there is a kind of a multiplicity of crises facing people, which I think sometimes from our very comfortable, relatively speaking, perch here in Ireland, we can actually forget about that complexity. So it's really very timely to hear you speak about this. Could I move on maybe to ask Constance? Constance, are you there? I can't actually see you.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Constance, would you?
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. My power has just gone off because I used solar, and now
Oh, wow. Yes.
Yeah, it's over. That's why I'm in darkness. But I see all of you and I hear what you're saying. So there's no problem. I'm with you. So
great.
the work that we do now, we started at with a small group. And as we started with a small group, these are women who are talking about climate change. And when we talk about climate change, we didn't know about climate change. At the end of the day, we thought it was God that was punishing us. Then after that, we said, now, with one person, you can't solve all these problems. Then we started with the small groups. Then the small groups, we united them and they became one. And it is a platform for the voiceless. And you find that these women bring their problems to the top. That is me and my committee. And when we sit, we talk about these issues, the effects of climate change, and how is it affecting the women? How are these women, when it comes to floods, how do they move from this place to the other? How are they abused in that area? Like when my sister, the home was flooded, my sister went to another person's home, the raised place. This person didn't know her, but she was there to take refuge. At the end of the day, the daughter was defiled by that very man. So there are so many bad things that is caused by climate change, which is not good for us, the women, the ladies of like a married woman like me, and you find that maybe you go and have sex with another person which you didn't negotiate. Such things happening, which is not good for us, and it is caused by climate change. And you find that. So we brought these women together to come up with the issues, and then how can we link them to other people who can help them. Then when they bring that the issues, we take the issues either to the family unit, that is the police, either we take to other NGOs that help with the women, the girl child, the children who migrate from village to town, maybe to go and do house girls, and they're abused at their work, they are not paid. They are paid maybe with the giving them to be pregnant by their bosses. Such things are things that we handle, and we make sure that we follow up all these things. And then at the end of the day, we take the issues to the right people and they are helped. So we have helped so many people, and now the women and the children, the girl child, they see our organization as a unity that can help them. And now most women are now joining, and the groups are now growing, and you find that these women are being helped. These women are now happy, and when they are in their homes, there's no domestic violence as it used to be, because domestic violence is something that makes a woman go away from the home, from the married home. So when the woman goes away, you find that the children are left. The children begin walking anyhow, moving to other areas. They are defiled, they are raped. So you find bad things happening. But I pray that when we came up with this group, we are now helping so many women and young children. And these early pregnancies are no longer there very much. Though the lockdown was there, it has brought these early pregnancies, but not as much as it used to be. Not, but not as much as when climate change was just beginning, because when climate change was beginning, we didn't know what climate change was. But at the end of the day, with the group sat, at the group, we discuss. After discussing, we refer them to those areas that they can be helped. And these days, we also help them, because we work with the Uganda National Women's Network. So they have given us the powers to help these women, either if there's this issue of arrest, no negotiation, they are taken, and they work on them according to their what they did wrong, or so.
Well, we come back to some of those issues, I think, Constance, but you know what I'm hearing is a tremendous grassroots and capacity building with women, probably not only women, I know, but certainly very centrally with women, of building their information base, their understanding, their capacity to go and actually take some action to change the situation. So very, very fascinating. And I think both your and Tanaya's references to the pandemic are also, I think, very interesting there, and we'll definitely come back to those. Could I ask Inderpal now, coming up next on my list here? You're working on a book, but talk to us about.
I'm not a climate scholar, but I do work on migration. Mm-hmm. And what I spend my time thinking about is how histories of imperialism and colonialism structure our current formations of gender and race, and how sort of global North and global South are interconnected in producing these kinds of vulnerabilities and problems that might lead to some groups of women. Not all women are equally impacted by different forms of climate change, right? But some groups become more vulnerable because of history and geography. And so what I look at is how the kind of broader context of imperialism, colonialism, allied to forms of nationalism and other sort of forms of domination create these vulnerabilities, right? That's what I look at. In terms of what is called transnational feminist research, which is what I do, it not only looks at histories of empire and the creation of these sort of vulnerabilities, but also I look at how impacts and policies and ideas produced in one place can have an impact on a distant, very distant other place. So, right. So when a lot of feminist research looks has a lot of valuable work in looking at people on the ground, or people looking at international treaties and how those can impact women too. But we look at the way in which this kind of entanglement and exchange across North and South, across borders, across different groups of people can impact each other. So we can see the ways in which climate change is a great example of how the kind of industrial capitalism and extraction produced by long histories of empire and colonialism have an impact on kind of women in very remote parts of the world too, in the Pacific or in the Sundarban, the Bengal Delta, or all kinds of places. In fact, all places around the world are impacted by that, right? I'm also interested in the ways in which, you know, we all think of global North and global South, but if you think about particular places, even in the global North, you will find kind of how there are different communities that are impacted, that are more vulnerable than others. In the US, for instance, in the South, we saw with Hurricane Katrina, for instance, it was Black women and Black families and African Americans who were most vulnerable to the impact of that catastrophe, also because of the failure of, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh,
I can.
It just went blank for a second.
Okay.
The ways in which those groups, particular groups, even in powerful imperial contexts, can be differently vulnerable. So I look at some of that, the ways in which North and South are just very broad heuristic terms that actually don't look at the experiences of particular groups. And some of the work that's happening to look at intersectionality, for instance, to look at how Black and brown women, migrant women are treated at the border of the United States, for instance, who is dying of the pandemic in, you know, a very, very wealthy country, tells you a great deal about how we need to think of particular groups as more vulnerable than others, right? Finally, I think about something, I know we're going to talk about the making of borders, and this is like a history of imperialism that is really critical, which is how borders and nation states produced by imperial powers have created certain kinds of blocks or obstacles or vulnerabilities for people trying to cross those borders. And I know our panelists will talk about that as well. I'm also, because I'm a humanities scholar, I'm interested in representation a lot. I'm interested in arts and humanities and how ideas that are very critical to thinking about representation and art can have an impact on policy, right? So when we think of climate change, I'm interested in thinking about the sort of what Rob Nixon calls slow violence, the kind of long, very drawn out shifts and changes that are often go unseen, happen, versus the big catastrophic changes that also take place in climate change. I'm interested in the way in which powerful countries are now, like the US, have bought into climate denialism, which is really interesting to me, to think about how racial capitalism can take place along with this kind of climate denialism, and the ways in which we now find a kind of, in the global north, a kind of alarmist notion of climate migration, which is, you know, millions of people are coming, so we should batten down the borders, and, you know, it creates all kinds of alarm within the global north to create more boundaries and more roadblocks for migrants as well. So denialism, alarmism, you know, different kinds of violence, we all see this play out in the arts and representational spaces. So I'm interested in some of those as well.
Okay, that's really very interesting and very rich. And of course, the whole question of intersectionality is really very important. And while gender is obviously very, very central, gender alone is really a bit of a blunt instrument, isn't it? It always needs to be thought through more, to be teased out, to have a look at the various factors that actually combine and interact and interweave in a human life, basically. I just move on now to Pelenise, please. And if you would tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing at the moment. Yep.
Mallory?
Yes.
Good morning. And I bring you greetings from Kiribati. Thank you, Stand, for this program.
Thank you.
Kiribati, actually, Kiribati has an anthem song and it starts with the word stand.
Ah, that's great.
That's why that was like when I saw the stand exhibition, I said, this is really a Kiribati strong word. We need to stand together.
Yeah.
And for the Kiribati Climate Action Network, I'm the national coordinator. It has been here since 2010. But we actually started working from 2008. It's a network of NGOs that are interested and working on climate change. That's the network. And we work together with CBOs, so community-based groups. That's a different group. So our network is just NGOs, but we work together with CBOs. And with Kiribati Climate Action Network, we've actually structured all of the CBOs in Tarawa, where we live or where we're working, which includes like 700 communities. Kiribati, when we talk about migration, that's one word that for the former government, they talk about migration with dignity.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talk about mitigation, we advocate around the world, two things that we really concentrate on: advocacy on mitigation and fundraising for adaptation. That's what we really try to tell the world. But right now, when we do our advocacy locally to Kiribati people about migration, they will not tell you that they want to move. Yes. All of them said, no, there is no moving out of Kiribati. There is no migration. If there is a migration, it's not about climate change. It has to be another reason, not climate change, because the differences between the migration is that climate change migration is permanent. There is no returning home. I am talking about migrating out of Kiribati, away yes. from the country. Yeah. Migration for other reasons, that means you still have your home and you still come back. So that people do not want to talk about migration at the moment. Maybe when there's really disaster and we really have to move out of Kiribati, that's when they said, okay, maybe we need to move. But right now they said, no. And I've asked questions to people like, do you want to move? Yes, we want to go everywhere in the world. You know, we want to see the world. But do you want to migrate and leave Kiribati? I mean, to go to Australia, to New Zealand, or the States, a developed country. and not come back. If there is no Kiribati, that's when they stop and they say, no, no, we're not moving. So when we talk, that's migration. But when we talk about climate change migration, this outside of Kiribati, no. It has happened once, a family that went to New Zealand and does it. It's a big issue, yes. But internally, there is migration. Internally in Kiribati, there is, people are vulnerable back in the islands and they're looking, if there is a disaster, they move within their own lands, or if the disaster is so big, you know, that they cannot adapt at that time, they move away from their land to other families, or they move from one island to another island, visiting, you know, just moving to their children or their families in other islands. That's internal migration. And it's always moving to families. You do not go and just stay on somebody's land. Okay, so when we talk about this kind of migration, internal migration, the question is, how are the women impacted? You know, men and women in this kind of internal migration. A woman in Kiribati's own lands, just like men, sisters and brothers, they own lands. But when you get married, you move to live with your husband. You live with him. But when this kind of, you know, disaster migration or climate change migration happens, and you have to leave that man's land, you can return to your home, to a woman. But many times you're not ready. The husband is not ready to come with you because it's not his land.
Yes.
And it's because it's a patriarchal society. They expect you to be with, he has to go to his other land or his families. And sometimes it makes it hard. It makes it hard for a woman, like not living with a husband on his land, but actually living with other families, his families, extended families. That can be, you know, seen as she's a burden to their family, you know, with her children. Maybe he's comfortable, but he's not comfortable, you know. If she could return to her home, to her own land, maybe that's okay for her. But a man, most men won't do it. You know, it's almost like a taboo. It's embarrassing that they have to go back. They have to go to. She returned to her land when he's gone, like he died. She can return to her land. That's for her children. The other thing I found, when we talk about land and owning property, like a woman has that right. But when it comes, also when it comes to marriage, if a woman, a Kiribati woman marrying a foreigner, now tell me, our law doesn't allow her children to become Kiribati.
Nice. And
that's the law right now in, you know, in Kiribati. And women are standing up and saying, no, when a man and a woman in Kiribati own lands, we all own lands. If a man married a foreigner, his children automatically become Kiribati. A woman doesn't have that right at the moment, you know. So those are the issues that we're facing. We're trying to, you know, push to our government and policies to change these kind of things, because it's already making women who are strong, who own properties, who own lands, the law does not allow them to be strong, you know. So there's many other things that we can discuss.
Oh yes, well, I mean, and there are a lot of very interesting points there. I mean, first of all, one of the points that you're making, which is very useful, I think, for us here in this part of the world to understand, is that there are many different kinds of climate-induced migration. As you say, with the internal migration, and of course there is the transnational migration. There's migration which is to do with the particular sudden maybe climate event. There is then that long, well, rapidly accelerating process where land is being invaded by the sea and so on and so forth. But what you're saying about women seems to me to be really very interesting, that one way and another, wherever you're talking about, that there can be a destabilization of more traditional and generally patriarchal systems and structures, which is again accelerated, increased, exacerbated maybe by the migration. And I'm wondering, does that, what Pelenise has been speaking about there, does that ring a bell, for example, with you, Tanaya, in the work that you're doing more or less in Bangladesh? That kind of impact on women and the kinds of socioeconomic and patriarchal structures that they live within.
Yes, thank you. I think that to grasp the nexus between climate change, migration, and gender, especially in the context of a patriarchal setting like the Bengal Delta region of both Bangladesh and India, and how they are related in complex nonlinear ways, it is crucial to realize that the immediate lived experiences of communities on the ground are different from the scientific understanding of climate change. And instead of imagining climate change as the direct driver of migration, something that directly causes migration, I think it makes sense to think of the climate change related impacts and risks as a sort of modifier that exacerbates existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. And to also understand that gendered power relations in this specific historical context inform these vulnerabilities, both shape and inform these vulnerabilities. And of course, I think going by an earlier point made by Inderpal, that gender does not operate alone, but the intersection of gender with other structures, including race, class, caste, age, religion, legal status, and colonial histories do matter a lot in this context. So considering the gender and mobility dynamics in this patriarchal context of Bangladesh and India, I think the traditional understanding of impact on women can mainly be seen through the process of male out-migration from villages following disasters or extreme events, where more burden has to be shouldered by women who remain back in the villages. And even for women who move with their families, and they share some experiences together as a family, but those women migrants can also experience challenges and barriers that are different, where they can be, if they're going to work, they can be exploited, whether as domestic workers or garment industry laborers, and or even victims and survivors of trafficking in this region. And interestingly, in India, women, though, have been viewed to constitute a significant proportion of internal migrants, the most prominent reason for their migration is reported as marriage in official statistics. And women are seldom recognized as economic actors beyond dependent members of households headed by men. And women also encounter different forms of violence, including domestic violence, but also experience forms of violence that may not be recognized or considered as violence very visibly. So for example, violence related with material scarcity. And women are, of course, also seen to be more vulnerable in terms of health and nutritional status. So instead of adding climate change impacts to this existing mobility and gender dynamics, I think it would be crucial to recognize that climate change impacts and its response in the form of migration not only reveal existing inequalities, but also work to reinforce these inequalities. And not unlike how the pandemic as a crisis has revealed how those who are already marginalized can be further marginalized.
Yes, That, again, I think is a really interesting and important point. Can I ask you, Inderpal, if you broadly agree with that kind of analysis, that it tends to, that this kind of climate migration, well, migration actually more broadly, not just climate-induced migration, but can have that and tends to have a very negative impact on women in particular. But does it, do you think, in some cases offer opportunities? Or is that too simplistic a way of thinking about it? Is that the kind of thing, that question I'm going to ask from where I'm sitting here in Dublin? In other words, can it give women, you know, I'm very conscious of Pelenise talking about the strength of women. So can it be used, and can capacity be built, really, I suppose, to strengthen women in these situations and to have a greater sense of their own agency?
You know, this question of women's agency, I think, is a really problematic one because of the way one has to think. And everybody's been talking, Tanaya, Constance, Pelenise, as sort of structured, the kind of structured vulnerabilities that are produced by not just patriarchal states, not just the states that say, you know, if you marry a foreigner, your child will not be able to be a citizen, but larger structures that are built into states, which are about economic value. Tanaya is talking about that, sort of who is valued more, you know, and where people can migrate, and if they can migrate depends on a whole system of economic value and structured differences that are produced, right? So the agents, what women, everybody exists in a set of constraints. You and I, everyone. We do the best we can in the set of constraints that we're given, and we all act in all kinds of ways. So I think that one has to presume and understand what those constraints are, to understand how people, where they can go, what they can do, right? And then some of these constraints are not just economic value, that value men's work more, wage labor more than informal economies, for instance. So there's the whole kind of international structures built in that devalue women's labor in particular. And we need to think about that, right? I think. You can see that, for instance, the states, we have to presume that all states are patriarchal. We just have to. And how you move from there means that you have to understand what those states do. Well, I mean, I'm studying Indian bureaucracy, and it's interesting to study how bureaucracy and kinship and patriarchal power and status are so interconnected. It's not just in the global South, in the North too, everywhere. So I think that I really have tried to think about infrastructures, structural differences and vulnerabilities, and the set of constraints as, you know, what people have to deal with no matter who they are. But I think presuming that, you know, challenging events create people who become leaders always happens for everyone, right?
Yes. Yes.
But some people have more advantages to do that than others. You know, if you speak English, you can do many things. And so class matters, right? Yeah, I'll stop at that.
Okay, no, but yes, absolutely. But I'm just thinking the work that you're doing, Constance, is very much about, if I understand correctly, it is actually to give women, or to work with women, so that they can actually gain and acquire the kinds of levels of self-confidence, the skills and the tools to actually raise their own voices, speak on their own behalf, actually begin to challenge the kinds of structures that I agree with Inderpal actually rule the world, in effect. And quite right, not just in one part of the world. We've no evidence to the contrary that it's any better. And how do you go about that? Would you like to say something about that, Constance? Oh, we can see you. Great. A little bit of you. Would you like to say a bit about the work that you're doing to effectively empower women to speak up for themselves in view of how difficult that is? I'm not sure if Constance is hearing us just at the moment. I think that Wi-Fi must be moving in and out. But let me throw out that question.
My network was.
Okay. I'm going to throw out the. Oh no, I thought that you popped up somewhere else, Pelenise. I'm throwing out that question anyway. I mean, how can we, or how is it possible? What can be done given this huge and growing swathes of migration, much of it, some of it at least climate induced? I mean, what kind of work can be done?
My network is.
Yes, I think.
Yeah, my network is disturbing a bit.
Yes.
Aha. Oh.
Okay.
You get me?
Yes, we can. Maybe we leave you to try and work that out for a moment or two and just keep that question.
Let me just
okay.
Talk about that, because like what we do in the community now, because there's a lot of poverty that climate change has brought. You find women very poor, men very poor. And what we do a lot of activities like savings and credit to empower them. They take small loans from their own savings, and they do small scale business at household level. So you find that at certain stages, they find that they are self-reliant, because they have something in the pocket. They do their own backyard gardening for sale and for their home food consumption. And there's a lot of tree planting that we do, tree planting for either for money and some for our own use, because when we make the nursery, we make a very big one at each and the household level. Then after making that, we sell off the tree seedlings to other people who wish, because we advocate for tree planting, because it is part of our activities that we do. So there's a lot of tree planting. We make money out of that, and they use that money to help them in the house. Men do help us, but not fully as it used to be. But you see, a woman does a lot of activities in a home. Like when I give you the 24-hour clock, you find a woman rests only for 4 hours. Men do rest for 8 hours, because a woman wakes up in the morning, by 5 o'clock to the garden. From the garden, they come back, pick vegetables, cook, sweep the house, take the goats to the water. So there's a lot of activities that a woman does up to maybe 10 o'clock. When he waits for the husband comes back, and she waits for the husband to eat up to midnight. You see, it's a long story about a woman domestic, a woman in a home, what she does and what she doesn't do. So the poverty level increases, and what do? We make them to have in their own groups. As we have these groups, we work with the groups. So we visit their groups, we train them, we educate them about tree planting, food production, about climate change itself, because at first they didn't know. So they are now adapting with the situation. They are now knowing that at such and such a time, we have to prepare the gardens. At such a time, we have to make we have to plant. Those early warning systems, we give them the early warning, we send out the social workers to help them plan for their homes, plan for their gardens, plan for their communities, and even in their homes, we talk, we counsel, we guide, and we talk about domestic violence, the causes of what brings that high level poverty, sickness, what. We do a lot of home improvement campaigns. The home improvement campaigns, we have to be with clean homes because we don't want sickness. Those are some of the issues that bring sickness bring poverty in a home, because the child is sick, you are not in the garden, you go where you move a lot, no money. So these days, women try to make sure that they all the time have money in their pocket. Now they grow vegetables during dry season, they sell. So there are a lot of activities that we and the women are doing, and even the men now appreciate. They these days don't go.
Do empower women, of course. But I think I'm actually quite horrified the way time is leaping ahead, and there are so many things that we still need to talk about. But I did want to come back to a couple of things. Inderpal, you were saying that obviously our thinking about borders is really very important. And I'm very conscious of that from a European perspective, where European countries, and I'm very happy to name those countries. Let me first of all stick a great big pin in Hungary, and happy to pin other countries as well, who are closing their borders to, or have closed their borders to migrants, or have put and are putting such restrictions in place. So, I mean, fundamentally, and I'm thinking now towards the future, given that the changing climate, the worsening impact on people, and indeed the worsening impact on women who are kind of there on the front line of the receiving end of this, is very, that is a happening thing, that we can't stop that immediately. Let's hope that we can eventually stop it somewhat. But what are we to do? And I'm asking everybody really, what are we to do about the borders? Because I'm thinking, Pelenise, in the South Pacific, if the sea does continue to rise, there is a very difficult future ahead. Similarly, looking over to Bangladesh, looking to so many different parts of the world. So given that we live in bordered spaces, and that we seem to be becoming more committed to our borders, and yet there's these waves and swathes of migration, as the climate worsens, the impacts are worse, these are continuing. So really, I'm asking you the impossible. What are we to do before we go to perhaps even more impossible questions? Does anybody want to rise to that challenge first? Or anybody want to comment? Tanaya, do I see you maybe keen to answer that? Or say
I think I just want to raise a point here about borders in addition to your thought that, and it is based on the learning from my research here. The international border between India and Bangladesh, that border is a colonial project that came into existence since 1947. And what I've been finding in my research is that the migrants I have been working with, they are all internal migrants. So none of them have crossed an internationally recognized borders. But regardless of that, they have crossed, even when they are migrating internally, or even returning, or even when they had to return to their villages in the middle of a pandemic-induced lockdown, they had to cross internal borders within a country. So for example, the state boundaries in India, they act as internal borders that are not very permeable. especially as we have seen by migrant workers. And so more than just geopolitical borders on the ground, there are social and symbolic borders in today's world that can sometimes become as formidable or even more formidable than crossing an internationally recognized border. So that was a point that I wanted to.
That's a very interesting point. Inderpal, you
wanted to say that what we're seeing today is sort of your question about Hungary was really interesting, right? In terms of how forms of nationalism, authoritarian power, and racism allied to are producing all these notions of, are making these borders more hard than they are actually, because all borders are differently porous, they're differently permeable. You know, if you're a wealthy person with a lot of money, you can go to a lot of places. Americans used to think they could go to a lot of places before the pandemic and before Trump. So, you know, things can change too over time. But I think that what worries me is these rise of these sort of nationalist movements, these racial, ethnic kinds of movements that are making these borders into checkpoints in all kinds of different ways, right? They're becoming more impermeable. And if you don't have those, and those kinds of forms of nationalism and racism will create ideas like Fortress Europe, that Europe is for white people, it's for Christians, and it is a tradition, and sort of the Hungarian people are this kind of racialized community or whatever. So it creates these kinds of Fortress Europe ideas, right? But it also creates particular targeted notions. The very I find very striking this kind of anti-trafficking discourse that has become really, really powerful everywhere around the world. And for me, this anti-trafficking is basically a way to check women's migration over borders. It's an anti-migrant discourse that says, if a woman is crossing a border, she is A, a sex worker, and B, being trafficked and has no agency and therefore needs to be stopped. So we've seen a whole lot of white savior stuff come up around this anti-trafficking. The other thing that's so interesting is citizenship, laws of citizenship. And I know Pelenise was talking about this, but citizenship laws are changing, visa restrictions are changing. All of these changes happen in relation to stopping people crossing borders that they used to be able to move across, right? I mean, we all have to remember the passport and documentation is a 20th century invention.
Yes, but it absolutely, but all of that makes the very simple baseline question of where are people to go. You, I think, raised it in Inderpal, you know, how are people to move, and how are they to be moving, and where are they to be going, and where will there be welcomes for them if necessary. Now, I'm very aware, Pelenise, that you were, you know, speaking about the attempts to mitigate, to ensure adaptive processes, but do you want to say anything? I mean, I'm aware also that from where you are in the South Pacific, there are very immediate, urgent problems of holding on to the islands that you have.
Yes.
But you know, would you like to say something about that?
Yes, we do really have big problems, not just Kiribati, but the whole Pacific. And we know that in the end, we will end up migrating.
Yeah.
And we hope that it does, we won't. That's why, because migration has a lot of complexities, and one of them is like, where do we go? And how are we going to be accepted by the host country? How do we keep our culture? How do we keep our language? How do we keep, what happens to Kiribati, our properties and our, our ocean, and maybe no longer our land, but we own the biggest ocean in the world. What happens? All these kind of questions come up, and I know that right now we say no. There's no option. We're not leaving. The other thing that really make us be strong in not leaving is all those things that we're going to lose. But like you talk about being nationalistic, our people own lands. That's the only thing that make us feel that we belong somewhere, and it's our identity, and nobody can question us. When you have a land in Kiribati, there's no poverty, because the word poverty is a Western word. It's not an island word. Poverty to us is when you have no land to build your house. You don't own any land to have all your needs. When you have your house, your basic needs I'm talking about, then you're not poor. It's not about a car or a mansion or money, no. So with all that needs that you have on that piece of little land in Kiribati, you're not poor. But migrating or being displaced means you've lost all that, you have become a poor person in the eyes of Kiribati people.
Yes.
So there is no question about we need to move, no. Otherwise, and we've seen that many people who have migrated out of Kiribati, they are part of a new country, but they will always feel that, what's the word? They are second class.
Yeah.
They are not really part of that.
And that was
and then,
yes.
Then you talk about racism and all that, in another country. So those are the maybe extreme things that can happen to them. But right now, when we talk about migration, even my government is adamant that no, there is no migration. And I think it's because of all those things that what do we, who are we when we leave Kiribati? Who?
Yeah.
Where do we go and who are we? And wherever we go, how are we going to be treated? We're just going to become some second-class people in another country. That's our biggest fear, I think. That's why we're not prepared to migrate.
Yes, and that's why we resist it and try to prevent that,
yes.
that comes to a point where it happens. And in fact, that's a question which has just been raised by somebody in the audience. How do we reconcile the loss of culture, or maybe the possible loss of culture as a result of climate change, which is such a fear for migrants? I'm not sure that there is no ready-made answer, I think, to that particular question. But there is another question, which I know some of the people listening would really love to hear you all say something about before we finish up, which is, I'll just read the question, because lovely question. I was just wondering if you'd any idea of how Irish and EU young people can help make a difference towards gender equality in migration and climate justice. And the questioner goes on to ask if you can think of a country that does have a more equal, an equal and more beneficial approach to migration. I can't think of one myself, I have to say, that I'm probably possibly wrong, or some sort of society that models ideal behaviors. But basically the question is, for all of you, I think, really, what can, in very practical ways, young people here in this country or throughout the EU, how can they practically be of support and help? So maybe I'll start off with Inderpal and come back over all of you. When I say practical, that includes thinking, that includes reflection, that includes rethinking all kinds of narratives.
Right. right? That's a great question. So thank you for that wonderful question. You know, in general, I am very struck by one thing in the international regime, which is the lack of real legal mechanisms internationally to make change happen. You know, we know climate treaties are there, but for instance, climate treaties often are not going to come into action soon enough, are being stopped by certain other powerful countries like the US, for instance. There's a lot of climate denialism in tandem with industrial racial capitalism to stop that from happening, right? So we are in an international regime that seems to have, you know, one part of the UN does migration, it works on human rights and migration, and that seems to be, you know, those are soft approaches. Those are, you know, humanitarian approaches. They're not really nailing countries for creating the problems that exist in other parts of the country, right? So, and the only solutions that I see happening in the US are people's, you know, even my students at Yale, they will say something like, oh, I'm creating this great new technology that will solve the problem. And you go like, yes, but how do you change the whole system that is really awful, you know, of this capitalism that we are faced with? So I think in that we have to assume a kind of imperial failure and a sanctioned violence on the part of the most powerful countries of the world to create problems for others. Now, in that context,
I just say, I know that moderators are not supposed to intervene actually in these things, but it does occur to me that this is maybe not a failure from the perspective of those who are in power. They haven't failed because they haven't really tried. They are maintaining a system in place, right, which, as another questioner has said, which maintains people who migrate and who have to migrate as underdogs. Which is what Pelenise was saying. So would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's the failure of the international regimes. It's a failure of the United Nations, but it's also its hands are tied in terms of international treaties, right? And you have all kinds of politics within these powerful countries that are creating the problems as well, right? And I can talk about it in terms of you know, the United States. But just to get to what people can do, I think one big thing is don't be white saviors. Like, you know, don't say I'm going to go and help people in this country and do this. Like, try to change the policy in your own country. Yes. That is the one big thing you can do in the first world. Go. I mean, this is what I tell my students. Instead of going to someplace far away and thinking you are doing some great work, go to Washington, D.C. Try your hand there. Right? That is a powerful place. So I would say become climate activists in your own local places. Do the research, find what's happening and how are the impact. I mean, for art students, kind of art related to climate change can be really amazing and impressive. And there's a whole body of it, right, in photography that they might be interested in. I was like, support migrants and refugees, speak up, you know, try not to think you're, I think the cultural preservation issue becomes a racial preservation issue for the most part, and one has to worry about that. So don't be part of Fortress Europe and its imperial history. I think we need to think in other ways. We need to think of thinking of refugees and migrants in terms of reparations. This is a reparation of imperialisms. Who has extracted from where? We need to really contend with that. And we need to recognize that we are all, I mean, in terms of, this is a planetary problem. This is not a problem of particular one place or the other place. We're all in this together. And so we need to think about it. And we need to, you know, become local national policy activist for a planetary future.
Thank you very much.
Amen.
Amen. Well, Pelenise, do you want to add anything to that?
So I really support that. So we've been working with many students
Yes.
In the first world in the first countries, and some professors who are actually taking our voices to Washington, D.C.
Yes.
If you go to Humans of Kiribati Facebook, you'll see all what they're doing outside of Kiribati. They do not have to come to Kiribati. We do not have to go there, you know, but everyone can work together to advocate. Thank you.
It is certainly true that, I mean, one of the great original principles of feminism was that you start where you are, you work from where you are. You don't immediately go to whatever or wherever. You start with what you have and where you are. Thank you very much. Constance, is there anything? I can't see you again. I don't know if your Wi-Fi is working, but I'm going to try to see if you have any comment to make on what young Irish students and young European students can actually do to really resist and combat what is happening in relation to migration, perhaps particularly in relation to women. I'm still thinking about that. Tanaya, will you pick up there? We'll hope to get Constance back perhaps in a moment.
Thank you. I want to add that we live in a world where mobility is a privilege, and it's often a privilege that is taken for granted. And the question of who can move or cannot move in response to a crisis, that process itself is also gendered. And I think there's need to consider the entire spectrum of mobility and immobility to unpack how the impacts can be gendered. And I think as students, we can act as bridges, as valuable bridges, because we can learn from perspectives and contexts, and also help others learn by bringing this understanding, this critical understanding, into our conversations with people around us, and along with building allyships and engaging with communities, and advocating for those who are disproportionately affected. I think as students, we can also contribute to public understanding of an issue, especially through social media, and maybe also potentially contribute to public scholarship, which I think is so essential and so critical for our world today that's witnessing changing global climates. That's not just environmental, but also cultural and political.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, and I do think within that kind of context that what students and others can do here, in just thinking about Ireland, is to constantly make the point to our politicians and our policymakers. And Ireland actually now has a place on the UN Security Council. So it is not nothing. We're a tiny country. And I think sometimes we forget that. We like to think that we're very big and very powerful. We're not, we're tiny. But we do have some kind of reputational credit that we can actually work with. And to say that I know the Paris Agreement actually contains some kind of general recognition that while we're all in this together, it is by no means an equal playing field. And it certainly is not an equal playing field when it comes to gender. And that we must always ensure that the different experiences and the unequal experiences of men and women are appropriately recognized and addressed and dealt with, that we not think of the migrant, which is in any case a horrible, condescending, patronizing, imperialist sort of thing to be thinking in the first place, but that gender really does make a very big difference. So I just wanted to read out one or two of the questions that we got in. Sorry, I know where. I'm now going to the chat. this came in really for Pelenise. It's not so much a question, just one of the concluding comments. As Pelenise says, climate migrants are the new underdogs. The Hungarian state and many others need a new underdog to stabilize the status quo due to the impoverishing of their own lowest classes, in inverted commas. The rich are getting richer everywhere, and the working class, including the proletariats in rags, have to be lifted up by generating a new underdog. And that is a pattern which we, I think, obviously see very clearly. And then another one, it's funny that you acknowledge, this is more for Inderpal, I think, the impact of arts in relation to climate justice. I'm in the process of scripting a performance piece surrounding women in migration, looking at different aspects of political downfall that dramatically affect those communities. And this discussion has provided me with such a strong insight into the conversations and passions I can involve in the theatrical workshops that I do in other European countries. So you are so correct in highlighting the importance of informing and making change in our own local cities and countries. And I think there possibly were some more. I'm not keeping up terribly well. The power of the arts is so often unrecognized. So I'm so pleased. I think that was you, Inderpal, actually responding. It is very true that we forget all too easily that the creative approach is so important. And I think also, very often I look at what passes for facilities for people who've migrated to this country. There's never anything about the arts. There's never anything at all about culture, anybody's culture, actually, Pelenise. There's never anything about creativity. It is just kind of survival. You throw meals at them and you throw a little bit of pocket money at them. And you say, well, actually, you've been here X amount of years. You can go get a job. You can have further education. But there's no real embracing of the person as a person. We're coming towards the end, and I really wanted to say thank you to each of you, to Constance, who I'm afraid we seem to have lost on the Wi-Fi over there in Uganda. If you can hear us, we're thinking of you, Constance, and very good luck with the wonderful work that you're doing with women at the grassroots to give them a sense of their own selves and their own power. A big thank you to Pelenise. You have many urgent issues to deal with, and again, we wish you well, but it is, as you've all said, it is up to all of us to try to stop and slow down climate change and to try to make sure that as many people as possible can stay in their homes. Thank you to Tanaya for all of your insights coming from a part of the world which is itself in a very difficult situation. But your research, I'm quite sure, will be very important and enriching for that. And to Inderpal for all of your wonderful insights garnered over a lifetime of research and reflection. And I'm certainly with you. I think we should bring down capitalism and patriarchy at the same time. And if we could do that, we'd be back maybe to square one. It would still be a very difficult world, but my goodness, we'd have a chance of getting somewhere, wouldn't we? I don't know if everybody agrees, but that's the thought I am left with, having listened to you all from very different parts of the world and very different experiences. It's really been a very rich evening. Thank you all very much for giving up your time to be with us this evening. Big waves.
Thank you.
And I think Joanne is coming in there, but big waves and actually big virtual hugs to absolutely everybody.
Thank you, Ailbhe. And just to echo actually what you've said, thank you so much to our amazing speakers tonight, Tanaya, Pelenise, Constance, and Inderpal. It was just so incredible to hear your insights and really, I think, Ailbhe, you mentioned it at the beginning, to be able to have people from all around the world here in one place tonight has just been really incredible. So thank you so much to everyone for taking their time to be here. And Ailbhe, thank you so much for leading that discussion and just being so amazing. It was so wonderful to have you here. And yeah, to our audience, I know we can't see your faces, but we can see that you're there. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, and hopefully you found the discussion as insightful and thought-provoking as I did. And hopefully you're coming away feeling empowered and ready to, I don't know, take action in some way. So thank you so much.
We're going to attack the government and get them to behave better. So
Exactly.
make our voices heard.
Just
Like-
that simple little action.
That's what we need to do.
Yeah, exactly.
And a lot more very good things on the
también.
festival program, by the way,
también.
Joanne, aren't there?
Yeah, and we actually, I left a link in the chat there for anybody who's interested in coming along to any more events. We have a few more panel discussions running this week and some workshops and film screenings as well. So
Yeah.
feel free to take a look at the event guide that I've left in the chat box there. But once again, thank you so much to our amazing panel, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening. And Pelenise, I know it's Tuesday morning over there, so good morning. And thank you so
Good morning,
much.
everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.